I've mentioned that the whole New Testament is apocalyptic in outlook. Well, some of the New Testament writings are also apocalyptic in literary genre. There's a particular kind of literature called apocalyptic literature. As I've said, the word apocalypsis or apocalypse means unveiling or revealing, revelation, not catastrophe, even though today that's pretty much how the word is used. It's not reporting. It's not some ancient person trying to find the words to describe a 21st century reality, trying to make sense of jet planes and helicopters and the like. It's not a secret code or a secret message that doesn't make sense until you pray enough or receive some mystical insight. Also, apocalyptic isn't just mere prediction of the future. As we've seen, it's focusing on present events as much as it's looking forward to what follows. And for the Apocalypse of John, those present events are the current events in Asia Minor in the late 1st century. The genre of apocalyptic has specific literary devices, the way all human communications do. These are less straightforward than the devices that we've seen so far in the other letters of the New Testament. So it helps to have more familiarity with the genre and to have some background in the history. Apocalyptic literature borrows its images intertextually. It takes the reader back to earlier images. In this case, images from Exodus, the plagues, images from Daniel, as we'll see, images from Ezekiel and Zechariah. So Revelation is intertextual. Now you'll see how much of the New Testament is intertextual. The New Testament church looked back intensely on their Old Testament as well as on some other literature to help them make sense of how things had developed with Jesus Christ's coming. But Revelation is especially intertextual. In fact, I want to compare it to a musical genre nowadays called a mashup. A mashup is where a DJ puts together samples of a whole variety of songs, or maybe just 2 songs back and forth, so that we hear something new that's basically drawing on the old. Apocalyptic samples earlier literature, including earlier apocalyptic, the way a mashup samples earlier music. I'll put a link in the video so that you can watch a mashup and think about what this means if you've never heard any of the music. I don't know who any of the people are myself, or whether you have, whether you know both the artists and the music. Next, apocalyptic literature employs a peculiar narrative structure, which is often non-linear. It doesn't just have a beginning, a middle, and an end in a temporal sequence. Even when it uses a temporal sequence, it often messes with that sequence and makes it complicated in a way that's unexpected to outsiders, but gets familiar to people who read a lot of apocalyptic, like the original audiences of this letter did. Here I want to cite a New Testament scholar, Craig Kester, from a book called Revelation and the End of All Things. Kester follows the proposal of an early church interpreter, Victorinus, that sees Revelation unfolding not in one linear sequence, but in 6 cycles, each of which portrays the same events, but now from a different perspective. It's not just repeating. You can see the spirals are moving from left to right, but it's also not just a line. So you can't assume that what happens in a later chapter comes after what comes in an earlier chapter. The Bible Project video on the book of Revelation, which is really well done, actually shows you the cycles that Kester is talking about. Over on the left, the first cycle, the message to the 7 churches that we've looked at, and then the scene of the throne of God. That you might call the first cycle, or maybe the first 2 cycles. Then come new cycles, the 7 seals from chapter 6 to the beginning of 8, the 7 horns from the middle of chapter 8 to the end of 11. And at the end of chapter 11 comes a kind of summary and a break between the first half of the book and the second. And then another cycle, 7 signs in chapters 12 through 14. And then 7 bowls in chapters 15 and 16. So far, let's count those as 6 cycles. Finally, we get a 7th over on the right hand of the screen from chapters 17 through the end. We have the fall of the beast, Babylon, the final battle between God and his enemy, and the marriage feast of the Lamb, Jesus and his church, in a new heaven and new earth. I want to leave the question open where the cycles begin and end because it's not entirely clear. Custer sees 6, which seems like a strange number in the book of Revelation where everything comes in 7s. Anyway, the point is not so much which cycle goes where or how many there are. This is a literary device, and if we miss it, we're going to start constructing a long sequence which actually isn't what the author intended. Apocalyptic literature offers words of warning as well as comfort, and we've seen that plenty in our other letters. It offers those to persecuted believers as well as comfortable believers, maybe legitimate believers, maybe believers at risk, as well as false teachers and false leaders. And we've seen that dynamic in the letters that we've looked at already. It's addressed to readers in contemporary contexts whose contexts are significant. The suffering and the circumstances of those churches in Asia Minor matter. They matter to the message of the book. The book is not saved for some later time, 2,000 years later, when circumstances suddenly start coming true. Things are coming true in the midst of these Greco-Roman congregations. Apocalyptic literature is addressed to audiences in the present. It's about the present. In fact, it's about what you might call a succession of presents, a succession of circumstances, which are all portentous. They all are significant in bringing about the end. The way in the book of Daniel, 4 beasts rise and fall, and those 4 beasts are 4 different empires. And the tribulations that God's people suffer under each of those beasts are significant. They all matter. They're not all just preparation for some later event. Apocalyptic literature generally is about a coming future, a coming final confrontation and final victory, but it's not just about that future. It ties the present, or a succession of present moments, maybe even including our present moment, it ties those into the final future. Apocalyptic literature uses what's now a familiar theme, the stark contrast between the faithful and the unfaithful, light and darkness. It distills those contrasts into 2 ultimates who are locked in a struggle that will finally resolve. On the one hand, we have the Lord and his representatives. And on the other hand, we have the adversary, the opponent, the accuser. The Hebrew for those terms is Shatan, Satan, the devil. So on the one hand, the Lord and his representatives. On the other hand, Satan and his. And these opponents of God and God's reign are spiritual opponents above all. So we might call them religious. But they're also political opponents. They're class, commercial, and ethical opponents, which is why apocalyptic literature is paying attention to so-called religious themes and so-called secular themes. That's a division that our age makes on the world, but that was not a division that was made back in the 1st century, especially when the emperor, Caesar, was calling himself Lord and demanding people worship him. All of these varieties of opponents, whether they are political, religious, class, commercial, or just behavioral opponents to God's reign, all of them get called blasphemers. So all of their acting out is acting out against God and God's reign. Well, like I've said, we've seen this in the literature so far, although we haven't seen it so starkly. Next, apocalyptic literature offers and inspires not just encouragement, but worship. The book of Revelation has been called the hymnal of the church because there are so many intense worship scenes. The writers of hymns and worship songs have gone again and again to Revelation for their images. Here are some examples of famous worship songs and hymns that draw their themes from the book of Revelation. I'll offer 7, naturally. Holy, holy, holy. Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing. How great is our God. We shall overcome. Crown him with many crowns. All hail the power of Jesus' name. And when the saints go marching in. So apocalyptic literature inspires worship and faithfulness in the midst of formidable challenges. And of course, we've seen this in the literature we've seen already. Why do I keep saying that? Because we are in the habit of singling out the Revelation of John as some kind of bizarre outlier literature that we sort of set aside, don't worry about it, leave it to experts, leave it to nuts and kooks. But really, once you understand its metaphors, once you pay attention to its message, it's not that different a message. I described a text's genre as its family. Well, Revelation belongs to a whole family. Here's what you might call a family tree of the book of Revelation, with parents like Ezekiel chapter 1, Daniel chapter 7 through 9, with aunts and uncles, the sibling oracles and First Enoch, which we already looked at, with siblings in the New Testament, passages like Mark chapter 13, which is worth looking at later as Jesus becomes an apocalyptic prophet. Revelation has cousins, the Apocalypse of Peter and the Shepherd of Hermas, which were popular and respected in the early church, although the church decided not to canonize them. Revelation is an influential work of literature. It has what you might call children, the Apocalypse of Paul, the Apocalypse of Thomas. These don't come from Paul or Thomas, but they were inspired by the Revelation of John and by other apocalyptic literature, just as some of that other apocalyptic literature had descendants in its family trees. You might think of the book of Thomas the Contender or the Christian siblings as cousins, second cousins, third cousins removed. Not too important. I want you to see, though, that Revelation lies within a tradition, and it inspires further tradition. Beyond its children are what I'll call its grandchildren. Down the centuries, Dante's Divine Comedy is what you might think of as a great-great-grandchild of the Apocalypse of John. And in the 20th century, this literature inspired the Left Behind series, the Late Great Planet Earth, the Omega Code, a whole host of contemporary treatments that tried to decode its symbols to show that the 20th century was the era that Revelation was really about. Of course, those 20th century treatments tend to treat those metaphors as pertaining only to our present, rather than primarily to the first century congregations that received the letter at first. Well, if the message of Revelation isn't that outlandish, if it's not that different from what we've read already, why put up with its strangeness? Why put up with its outlandish form, which has spawned so many kind of kooky treatments over the centuries? Well, here are some reasons. Texts don't just mean things, they don't just convey messages. Texts do things, and apocalyptic literature does some things really well. Apocalyptic changes its readers in a number of ways. Because, for one thing, it gets our attention. Obviously, Revelation gets our attention. In fact, it captures our imagination. Think of all those hymns. A while ago, I led a series at one of my churches on the book of Revelation, and I was talking to the worship leader of that church about it, and he said, "Oh, I love the book of Revelation." I said, "Why?" And he said, "It's got so much worship." I think its literary form inspires worship. Also, apocalyptic literature unmasks, it unveils or reveals the deeper nature of a reality that people usually take for granted. Let me give you a metaphor for that. The Wizard of Oz, that classic film. Dorothy and her companions journey on the yellow brick road to the city of Oz to meet the great and terrible Oz. And the great Oz is a terrible and imposing figure. Look at this guy. Look at the flames. Until the dog, Toto, pulls away the curtain. We see the man behind the curtain, and he's an ordinary man. Revelation unmasks the deeper nature of a reality that people take at face value. In the case of the book of Revelation, it's not an ordinary man behind the curtain. It's Satan behind the curtain of the beast, the Roman Empire, behind the communities that reject their own Messiah and his followers. Let's look at a detail from that Bible Project poster on Revelation. I love the image in the lower right. Here you have a Roman slaying a Christian, and the arrow tells you the Roman soldier is not the real enemy. Look at the shadow behind and you will find the dragon, that ancient serpent. In the book of Revelation, the man is in front of the curtain. It's the spiritual powers that are behind the curtain. This genre begs a question. Today, who and what are in front of that dragon behind the curtain? C.S. Lewis gave his answer to that question in a classic little book called The Screwtape Letters, which reveals the spiritual forces behind the ordinary events of the lives of believers and non-believers. It's a kind of apocalyptic literature in a 20th century form. Very different, however, from the late great Planet Earth or the Omega Code or left behind. Apocalyptic literature discerns. It discerns God's future judgment, not just out there someday, but breaking into the present. When the beasts rise and then fall, every one of those falls is a kind of divine judgment against its opposition. And every beast that falls demonstrates the unsustainability of a life in opposition to reality, to God and God's reign. That's a message that apocalyptic literature delivers so powerfully and effectively. Those past judgments on empires long gone, those present-day judgments on beasts and false prophets and oppositional communities, and God's coming judgments in the next decade, the next century, and whenever the curtain finally falls on this world. All of those judgments are united. They're all parts of a whole, one cosmic divine act of deliverance. Finally, apocalyptic literature offers an ethic, a way of responding. Remember, texts do things, and one of the things that apocalyptic literature does is it tells us to watch. Revelation 2 and 3 keep saying, listen to what the Spirit is saying. And then behold, watch, pay attention. But don't just pay attention to surface appearances. Pay attention to the deeper significance of those surface events. This is Jesus' last word in his apocalyptic message in Mark chapter 13. After delivering signs of the end of the age, warnings of tribulations, Jesus finally says, what I say to you who are present, I say to all. There's that overflow audience, that universal audience for apocalyptic literature. Watch, stay awake. Don't get lulled into complacency, and don't give up under pressure.